Imagine this. It is May 1945, Berlin. Smoke fills the air. The last bastion of the Third Reich has just fallen. A young Soviet second lieutenant leaps from the driver's seat, his face smeared with soot but his expression ecstatic. He embraces his comrades, shouting "Ura" to celebrate the victory of the Great Patriotic War. It's a perfect historical moment, right? But if we pull the camera closer, you will spot details that seem out of place, perhaps even jarring. Look closely. The boots on this lieutenant's feet are not the standard-issue Soviet rough-cloth boots, but premium leather boots from Chicago. The tin of celebratory luncheon meat in his hand is stamped "Spam," produced in Minnesota. And that green truck behind him, which just towed heavy artillery into the city center, the hood is emblazoned with Studebaker origin, Indiana. Even more interesting, if you were to ask this lieutenant, "Comrade, who helped you win this war?" he would unhesitatingly tell you it was Comrade Stalin and the iron will of the Soviet people. He would never mention the American manufacturing that kept him fed, warm, and moving fast. Today, we are going to tear off the seal of history and talk about the most underrated and selectively forgotten campaign of World War II, one not fought in the trenches, but on assembly lines and shipping lanes. The Lend-Lease Act. To understand where this begins, we must turn the clock back to the summer of 1941. At that time, the Soviet Union wasn't celebrating. It was facing extinction. On June 22, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, and 3 million German troops flooded into the Soviet Union like a tide. In the first few months, Soviet losses were catastrophic. It wasn't just the casualties, it was the collapse of the industrial system. Imagine this. The Soviet Union's richest industrial regions, Ukraine and Belarus, fell within weeks. Although the Soviets undertook the largest industrial evacuation in human history, dismantling thousands of factories and moving them east of the Urals, restoring production takes time. And during that time gap, the Red Army was fighting virtually naked. We often say the Soviets relied on human wave tactics, but even human waves need guns, bullets, and shoes. How desperate was the situation? By late 1941, the Soviets didn't just lack tanks, they lacked aluminum, without which you cannot build planes. They lacked copper, without which you cannot make telephone wires, leaving frontline communication to shouting. They even lacked high-octane aviation fuel. Soviet refineries couldn't meet the technical standards, meaning their planes couldn't fly fast or high. The Soviet leadership knew very well that on their own, they might not survive the winter. Later, Khrushchev wrote bluntly in his memoirs, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war." This wasn't polite diplomatic talk. It was the honest truth in the face of a survival crisis. And so, a lifeline connecting American factories to the Soviet front began to be built in the most dangerous places on Earth. The establishment of this lifeline was a thriller movie in itself. There were 3 main routes to get supplies into the USSR, each operating in hell mode. The first was the Arctic route, the most famous one. Allied convoys had to sail from Iceland through the North Atlantic, directly to Murmansk. It sounds direct, but what did they face? Temperatures tens of degrees below zero, waves as high as mountains, German U-boats lurking underwater, and bombers circling overhead. In the tragic PQ-17 convoy, 35 merchant ships set sail, and only 11 made it to the USSR alive. Sailors said that if you fell into the Arctic Ocean, you had only minutes before your heart froze and stopped. Yet thousands of tons of aluminum, explosives, and machine tools were pushed through the gunfire this way. However, the Arctic route was too dangerous in winter and limited in capacity. What truly made the Soviet Army move was a more secretive and grander route, the Persian Corridor. This route started in the US, went halfway around the globe, landed in Iran, and then went north into the Soviet heartland via rail and road. To open this route, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers essentially built a modern logistics system from scratch in the deserts and mountains of Iran. Here, the Americans taught the Soviets their first lesson in efficiency. Soviet receivers were stunned by the speed of American unloading. At Persian Gulf ports, Americans shipped thousands of trucks as disassembled parts, packed like building blocks, and assembled them on site in Iran. Factories ran 24 hours a day in 40-degree heat, and the assembled trucks immediately drove over rugged mountains toward Azerbaijan. This route eventually handled nearly half of all Lend-Lease supplies. On these dusty roads, a beast that would change the ecology of the Eastern Front arrived. the Studebaker US-6. You might ask, isn't it just a truck? Is it that important? In the context of World War II, trucks were the Army's legs. Before the Studebaker, the main Soviet truck was the Gaz AA, a copy of the Ford Model AA with only rear-wheel drive. It was fine on flat roads, but the Soviet battlefield was endless mud, autumn sludge, and deep winter snow. Soviet trucks would get stuck immediately, artillery couldn't be towed, supplies couldn't be delivered, and soldiers had to walk. Then came the Studebaker. This was a 6x6 all-wheel drive beast with 95 horsepower, designed to drive where there were no roads. When Soviet drivers first drove it, the feeling was like switching from an old bicycle to an off-road vehicle. It could drag cannons through mud and climb steep slopes Soviet trucks wouldn't dare attempt. Soviet soldiers loved this vehicle so much they gave it a nickname, Studer. In the counteroffensive phase of the war, the mechanized units of the Red Army were almost entirely carried on American wheels. There is a very ironic but real detail here regarding the famous Soviet weapon, the Katyusha rocket launcher. In our minds, this is the icon of the Red Army, right? But if you look at historical photos, you will find that in the middle and late stages of the war, the vast majority of Katyusha launchers were mounted on American Studebaker chassis. Why? Because the Soviet truck chassis were too fragile to withstand the massive recoil and vibration of a rocket salvo. The frames would warp after a few shots. Only the sturdy American Studebaker could handle that violent firepower. So, you could say it was an American chassis carrying Soviet artillery that blasted the Nazis back to Berlin. This is probably the most hardcore mashup of World War II. How many vehicles did the US provide to the Soviet Union? The number is staggering. Over 400,000 trucks and jeeps. By comparison, the Soviet Union itself produced less than 200,000 vehicles during the entire war, with far inferior performance. By 1945, for every 3 vehicles in the Red Army, 2 were American-made. This meant the Red Army's speed of advance was no longer limited by soldiers' legs or horses' endurance. The famous Operation Bagration, where Soviet troops tore through German lines like lightning and advanced dozens of kilometers a day, relied on this massive logistics army, drinking American gasoline and driving American trucks. But the American influence didn't stop at the wheels. If trucks solved the problem of moving, next we must talk about eating and flying. The psychological impact of these on ordinary Soviet soldiers and elite pilots was perhaps even greater than the trucks. Imagine a Soviet soldier who has been lying in a trench for 3 days, gnawing on moldy black bread, suddenly receiving a shiny tin can with the unintelligible English letters, Spam. When he pries it open with a bayonet, inside is pink, fatty, rich luncheon meat. In that moment, ideological barriers seem insignificant in the face of protein. This is a story about hunger and dignity. In the hardest years of World War II, the Soviet Union lost not only territory, but its breadbasket. After the Black Earth of Ukraine fell, the Red Army faced a very real problem: how to feed millions of troops. The American food industrial machine kicked into gear. The Americans didn't just send existing stock, they customized production lines specifically for Soviet tastes. There's a famous term here, tushanka. This is a traditional Russian stewed meat. American food companies got the recipe and, using their massive livestock resources, began frantically producing this high-calorie stew. Imagine the scene. In the freezing trenches of Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers gathered around a small fire, boiling a pot of steaming meat stew. The aroma of that fat in the minus 30-degree air was simply the scent of life. As they ate, the soldiers cracked jokes filled with black humor. Pointing at the cans, they'd say, "Look, this is the second front." It was a sarcastic dig at the Allies for delaying the opening of a ground front in Europe. But deep down, they knew that without this second front shipped across the ocean, they wouldn't have the strength to pull the trigger. And the Americans sent more than just luncheon meat. There was egg powder, dehydrated vegetables, and even alcohol. Khrushchev later admitted, "Without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army." Behind this sentence lies a brutal reality. But if you think the material shock was limited to their mouths, you are mistaken. What truly reshaped the worldview of Soviet soldiers was what they wore on their feet. In the early days of the war, many Soviet soldiers wore simple leg wrappings and rough cloth shoes, or even bast shoes made of woven bark. In the Russian mud, this gear was a disaster. Through Lend-Lease, the U.S. provided nearly 15 million pairs of army boots and enough premium leather to produce even more. Historians have calculated a stunning statistic. By the end of the war, almost every pair of feet in the Red Army was either wearing boots made in America or boots sewn in the Soviet Union using American leather. So, when we see documentaries of the Red Army marching in unison across Red Square or charging the Reichstag, remember, the foundation of those resounding footsteps was American cowhide. This wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a guarantee of mobility and key to reducing non-combat attrition. Trench foot can disable a division, and a good pair of boots is the best vaccine. If trucks and boots changed the ground forces, then in the sky, the shock of technology and lifestyle was even more intense. We have to mention the legendary fighter plane, the P-39 Aira Cobra. This plane was not highly rated by the U.S. military itself, but in the hands of Soviet aces, it became a divine weapon. The Soviet Union's second highest-ranking ace, Alexander Pokrishkin, shot down dozens of German planes flying a P-39. But today, we aren't talking tactics. We're talking about the feeling Soviet pilots had when they first sat in a P-39 cockpit. Before that, Soviet La-GG-3 or Yak-1 fighters were, frankly, more like rough, semi-handmade products than industrial goods. The cockpits were simple, sometimes with wooden parts, poor ceiling, and freezing cold in winter. Radios? Those were a rarity. Many planes had no radios at all, and communication relied on wobbling wings. Then, they sat in the P-39. The first thing that hit them was leather seats. Yes, the Americans even upholstered fighter jet seats in leather, perfectly cushioned. Next was the climate control system. The cockpit had heating. For pilots fighting at high altitudes and in cold zones, this was like going from hell to heaven. Then look at the instrument panel. Precision machining, clear scales, and a powerful radio communication system. Soviet pilots experienced air-to-ground coordination for the first time. They could clearly hear tower instructions and coordinate tactics with teammates in real time, rather than fighting alone as before. Even in the plane's survival kit, Soviet pilots found chocolate, cigarettes, and exquisite lighters. This focus on the human, this attention to comfort, brought a huge psychological shock to Soviet soldiers accustomed to collectivism and overcoming difficulties. It was a cultural shock from another world. So, fighting a war can be dignified too. This shock was silent, but the seeds it planted in the minds of the Soviet elite were perhaps more profound than thousands of tons of explosives. However, the end of the story is not as beautiful as a fairy tale. In 1945, the war ended. Nazi Germany surrendered, and humanity welcomed peace. But immediately after, the Iron Curtain fell. Allies who had fought side by side became rivals overnight. At this moment, the fate of these American heroes who helped the Soviet Union win the war became extremely awkward. For Stalin, admitting that the Soviet Union's great victory relied on American supplies was a political taboo. It would weaken the narrative of the superiority of the Soviet system. Thus, a massive operation of collective amnesia began. In Soviet official propaganda, movies, and textbooks, the existence of the Lend-Lease Act was extremely downplayed or completely erased. Those Studebaker trucks that had performed distinguished service began to be disposed of systematically. According to the terms of the Lend-Lease Act, after the war, unconsumed materials had to be either returned to the U.S. or paid for. The Soviet Union wanted neither to pay nor to let this American evidence remain in the country. And so, a heartbreaking scene appeared at many ports. Brand new trucks fresh off the line, or hero vehicles covered in metals from the battlefield, were driven under giant hydraulic presses, crushed into flat scrap iron, and loaded onto ships to be returned to the U.S. as scrap metal. Others were simply pushed directly into the sea. American receiving officials watched this scene in stunned silence. This wasn't just waste. It was destruction fueled by hatred. Throughout the following decades of the Cold War, if you mentioned these supplies in the Soviet Union, the answer was often scornful. Oh, that American junk? We hardly used it. But the surviving veterans, the old men who had eaten Tushonka, driven Studers, and worn American boots, knew the truth in their hearts. It was just that this truth was sealed behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, when dusty archives were declassified, that we could see the full picture of this lifeline again. Finally, let us return to that opening scene, Berlin. 1945, that Studebaker truck parked in front of the Reichstag. It is not just a vehicle, it is a microcosm of an era. It witnessed the largest industrial collaboration in human history, as well as humanity's deepest suspicions and divides. This war tells us that victory is never a one-man show. The soldiers bleeding on the front lines are heroes, but behind them, the workers mining iron ore, the women assembling engines, the sailors risking death on the icy Atlantic, they are also the cornerstones of this monument to victory. History should not be forgotten, nor should it be whitewashed. When we strip away those grand political narratives, what remains is the most real, warm story of human beings.